District. And right now, it is my pleasure to bring in to my show Douglas Applegate, who is running in the 49th District against the retiring Darrell Issa. How you doing tonight, Doug?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here, Lauren.
Well, before we get into your race and some of the things, what's your opinion about getting along with Russia?
Russia is the progeny of the Soviet Union with respect to world power game of chess. They're still a player. And the thing that I fear the most is any military industrial complex. And I'm a firm believer in war's a racket. General Smedley Butler started talking about that in the late 20s until his death, and just about 5 or 6 years later. And I think war is a racket. And what we are in the middle of right now, continuing on in Syria, is the longest war in U.S. history. Nobody's talking about that. Congress refuses to vote by roll call for the continued use of military force. They're using the same resolution that I call it. There were 1.5 resolutions after 9/11 to justify their global war on terrorism. And that's just not sufficient under the U.S. Constitution. And I get back to my distrust of any entity who tries to sell chicken shit wars on the basis that kinetic military operation can provide real change. It only stops whatever's happening for a brief period of time, and there's no final resolution. And you pick any war in history, and it didn't end in injustice or really stop, the evil that was going on in any particular region. It just moved on to a different contest. So I look at it not from the standpoint of who is our adversary, but what game are we playing? And if it's military operations, there are no winners. And people of the world, in particular people of the United States, have been sold a bill of goods with very few exceptions. The Civil War might be one to argue that it was just because it was fought at least on the part of the North to end slavery, and I truly believe that when you look at the declarations of the Confederate States and the evil that was unleashed during World War II was one that I think gave a false expectation of what military power can accomplish.
Now, let's talk about sanctions, because he was talking about starving the Russians, and he said if you put sanctions on their people, maybe they'll get rid of their oligarchic government. And that really hasn't worked out too well for us. I mean, we put sanctions on Iraq, and according to the Lancet, 500,000 children were killed as a result of it. We put sanctions on Cuba. We put sanctions on North Korea, and those communist governments are still standing. So what is your opinion on sanctions?
Well, I'll give you another metric to consider when we're talking about the efficacy of sanctions. In every case, money found a way to move out of the sanctioned sovereign into another area. If you go to Jordan and you can walk down many streets and say, oh, that building was funded with Iraqi dinars during the sanction period after the Gulf War. And there's also a brain drain that sanctions has an effect on. So, and right now, the State Department doesn't even have a sanctions department in operation. So even though Trump is expecting to order some sanctions when he's backed out of the Iranian deal, he has no effective ability to enforce those sanctions. It's just like military power. Mm-hmm. It does not end something. It just makes something move out of the effective area. So, and I don't know that whenever you're talking about, in effect, regime change,
Yes.
whether or not it's sanctions, whether or not it's the military. You really have to take a hard measure of the metrics of the people that you expect to revolt and to support the next regime, whether it be a dictatorship as the next regime, or whether or not it's a democracy, or whether or not it's a socialist government. And that's the real metric. Outside forces seldom have ever been effective in regime change.
And worse, what you end up having is blowback. Like if you look at our removal of Mossadegh in Iran, because he had the temerity to nationalize the oil company, take it away from BP, so that God forbid the Iranian people should have the benefit of the Iranian oil. You ended up with the Shah of Iran and his brutal secret police, the Savak, and that led to the Khomeini revolution and fundamentalism. And we have the blowback from what happened in Iraq and Libya and now Syria. I mean, I'm talking to you about this sort of at length because you are in the military. You're a retired Marine Corps colonel, right?
Correct.
That's your background. And yet I think people in the military sometimes have the most sober and cautious aspect about war. They're not the most gung-ho to get in there because they see, you know, the devastating effects of it.
I think I'm not arguing the semantics on this. I think it's really a question of being realistic. I've seen different flag officers, general officers, lack real caution. But the real metric you need to look at as far as what do we do with military force is be realistic, be honest. And I was just talking with a very knowledgeable, involved group in the 49th this evening. And I said, look, the one thing that's always frustrating, at least to me, and I'm sure other professional military officers that have served, a couple decades, is that there would never be a problem in calling up from the Pentagon to the Hill officers that can tell you the cost of any military use of force in terms of blood, treasure, and duration. Because we rewrite these plans and update them every 18 months for practically every spot around the globe in the Pentagon. And that's never considered when Congress decides to do a resolution or decides not to invoke the War Powers Act that would require the executive branch to justify why they've taken military action. And it just boggles me that there's enough people with military experience that they could do that. Yeah. I don't think there's enough veterans in Congress now that can realistically vote and demand vote on the use of military force. I think that's one of the problems that we've shrunk the number of veterans on the Hill. And you really don't understand what you're asking your children and grandchildren to do unless you've done it yourself, been there, served. And there, I think that veterans are much more cautious.
Well, it's always the poorest among us that go to war. And partly that's because we've hollowed out the country, the heartland of the country, with these trade agreements. And it's no longer easy for somebody with just a high school education to get a job in a factory and make a good living, such that his wife doesn't have to work if she wants to be a stay-at-home mom and, own a home. I mean, now it's so expensive to go to college, and a lot of people, if they can't afford it, they don't want to take out that kind of debt because it's starting to turn out that even with a college degree, you can't get a job and pay back all that debt. So a lot of people go into the armed services because, not just the paycheck, but they will get free college. And so you're right. It's like it goes back to the anti-war movement when I was a little girl, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Fortunate Son, I'm not the senator's son. And all these presidents that we've had from whether
a great tune by
one of my favorites. Yeah. Whether it's Bill Clinton or, George W. Bush, got out of serving in the war. Would you support, I guess Charlie Rangel introduces this every year, Congressman Rangel from New York, reinstatement of the draft?
You know what? It's unnecessary. I would rather, a couple things, and I don't mean to duck the question. So please, after I finish, if you want to say, you haven't given me an answer yet, I hope this is. You know, and I think part of it is really coming of age during the Vietnam War. Conscription, the draft, is just something that I never see being effective. What I'd like to see is more public service, and I think that while I would like to make it mandatory, I would rather use a carrot rather than a stick. And because it's so difficult to get employment even after going to college, I think that there should be carrots of debt forgiveness, college debt forgiveness if you go into public service, that there used to be more of when I was going to college and when I got out, as well as saying go into public service jobs with a livable wage and with benefits. But I think that it's still a public service job, so there should be some continuing benefits like, okay, you get 3 years of tax credits after you finish. I don't think everybody needs to go into the military. First of all, not every young woman or young man is cut out for the discipline that the military requires. And it's not that discipline in and of itself is an admirable thing. It's just something necessary, quite frankly, when you're facing a profession where you have to order people to go out and get maimed or killed.
Well, let me just say this. I didn't ask that question because I want everybody to go into the military. I asked that question because I think that if you had a draft, you would have a vibrant anti-war movement in this country again.
That I would agree with, and I think that was implicit in my answer, because I think most conscription and draft, particularly long-term drafts, which was post-World War II, ultimately end in a population that will not support the military, let alone not support wars.
Yeah. All right. I think we've talked about war enough. Anything else you want to say on foreign policy in general before we move to your domestic policies?
Only that I'm still very troubled about the Korean Peninsula. And I think that there's been a lot of false hopes already stirred up by the media, on both sides of the right media as well as the left media, in false expectations about what North Korea will really do. And there hasn't been, other than Iran, an effort to stop a nation from developing nuclear weapons. And Trump's just given every country in the world to distrust any deal to do that with the Iranian repudiation of the deal. It's so counterintuitive. It's ridiculous. And that's where my biggest fears are right now, as far as a flashpoint and an existential threat to the world economy and to a number of nations.
Why don't you tell us the communities that are in the 49th district, and also talk about your qualifications. You ran for this office before, and you got within less than 2,000 votes from beating this guy, and they said it was the closest congressional race of all the races that year.
1,621 votes. It was the last race called, and the district goes from, excuse me, Ladera Ranch, which is just north of San Juan Capistrano, straight down the beach. It includes the inland towns of Vista and Rancho Santa Fe, down to one street in La Jolla. So it's a beach district.
Yeah.
And Camp Pendleton is right in the middle of it. And Camp Pendleton is really what changes the dynamics of what is now still a Republican district. It's R+6 approximately, might get down to an R+5. But the largest single metric and demographic of the 49th would be the fact that 60%, 60 to 65% are in some way connected with veteran households. And because of Camp Pendleton's presence, it's a Marine veteran household area. And I think that's one of the reasons why I thought that a Democrat could speak not only to working families, which is important from my background because I grew up outside of Dayton, Ohio in a blue-collar family, and understood about layoffs, grievances, seniority from the time I was about 6 years old, because the union local met in our very small kitchen of a duplex. And I've been in this district since 1981 as a trial attorney, as a Marine. I've got 32 years active in reserve service, and I've been a Marine since 1974. I've been a civil rights attorney, and I'm not an attorney that's represented corporations at all. That's just a choice I made, that was the type of civilian practice I wanted to have. I still do white collar federal criminal work, although I haven't done much in the last 3 years. I do have a couple cases I'm trying to wrap up in federal court. And I think that allows me to speak to a lot of specific areas, the criminal justice system, which is a wreck. And justice may be blind, but she's got a pocket that's always stuff that shifts the scales. And we haven't been honest about that to America. Mm-hmm. And I'm always saying my favorite line, but it's a false line from To Kill a Mockingbird, is, Atticus Finch, when he says, our courts are the great levelers. That's not true, because you only get the justice you can afford.
Right.
Our education and our schools can be the great leveler, but we're not doing a very good job of that either. But that's, and the microcosm of the 49th is, okay, it is a beach district, but I've got one of the lowest per capita incomes in Southern California, in Vista in the district. I have some of the wealthiest. I have Biotech Beach that is at the south tip of the 49th, and it's 50% of the biotech companies. And I view biotech as the real way of changing our healthcare system, because we need to capture efficiencies, not with drugs that have a 20-year business life expectancy, but rather cures that will shift our how we approach healthcare. And I've always been for single payer. That sells and sold the last time in 2016 to an affluent community as well as Vista. If you're in a beach district, it's easy to be house poor, even if you have two W-2 wage earners making a fairly healthy six-figure income, because of the prices of homes and the lack of affordable housing. So it's a combination of things. I'm not trying to pitch the beach community of the 49th as somewhere in middle America like Kansas or even Ohio, where I grew up. It's completely different, and it is a different standard of living. But they still fear medical bankruptcies. They still fear, they don't have the 10% copay if there's a recurrence of breast cancer, but the next chemotherapy is going to cost, $500,000. They don't have $50K laying around. And so I think it's sort of, we're at a juncture where it doesn't make any difference unless you're in the 1%, we're all screwed.
Yeah.
Unless we change education and healthcare, and ultimately what we do about renewables replacing carbon fuel energy. And we have a glut of carbon fuel energy right now.
Now let's pivot over to the environment, because climate change is one of the most important issues to me anyway, because I think it's an existential issue. Climate change and nuclear war are the two things that can end human civilization on the planet. You support Tulsi Gabbard's OFF Act, but you think we could go 100% renewable even earlier, don't you?
It's not me. It's international business consultants like Deloitte who are telling the largest corporations in the world sustainability is your best return on investment. The highest ROI right now are corporations that are they're reducing their use to maintain warm, light buildings. Mm. And that's 40% of our electricity use in California is for buildings. And then when you start looking at the ability to substitute renewables, because renewable energy, no matter what the medium, is getting more and more cost effective. And that's simply not the case for oil, even though we have an carbon fuel energy glut because of fracking for natural gas, oil. It's still a huge battle and a huge waste. And in California, Sacramento's been boasting that they could get to 100% renewables by 2050. I don't think we have 20 until 2050. No. I think the existential threat is much closer. And I think that if you started ending oil subsidies, you can harness market powers to force everybody into 100% renewables within 10 years. But there is a problem and nobody's really talking about it that much at a political level.
The battery storage?
No, I'm going to go a different direction. And I don't think we had a chance to talk about this earlier. It's fine for us to say, we're going to put solar panels up on our roof. We're going to buy Teslas, whether or not you get an expensive one or an affordable $50K Tesla. And everybody wants to see their electric meters reverse course. Mm-hmm. And that's great. But the fact of the matter is the remnants of the public utilities in the United States are still going to get the same, by law, return on their capital investment. And they've made capital investments long-term that are probably going to be in use for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Although we have shut down San Onofre in your district.
You're right.
And they are shutting down Diablo Canyon. And right now, my friends over at Food and Water Watch feel that Sempra and SoCalGas is trying to manufacture an artificial shortage, which they do every summer, so that they can justify keeping Aliso Canyon open, which was the largest methane gas leak in the history of our nation. It leaked for 4 months. And I think that they don't need that gas. Food and Water Watch has shown they don't need that gas. So, but Jerry Brown has taken $9.8 million from the oil and energy company, and his sister Kathleen sits on the board of Sempra Energy, where she gets paid a lot of money. So, I mean, now we're back to money in politics.
Money, politics, and who's going to pay for the energy savings that renewables will bring. And it's still going to be the wrong end of the 99%. That's, that's the big thing that we need to start putting back in balance, because it's the top of the wage pyramid that's going to benefit from the renewables. We already see it in our electricity rates that now they're making such a distinction between peak hours, off hours.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know that they could actually, at various locations during off hours, pump water uphill to reservoirs that during the peak hours, then they can use to run hydroelectric turbines during the peak hours and actually create, and that's all renewables, as long as the electricity is that you're using is coming from renewables. And California does not count the British Columbia hydroelectricity that comes down in a DC line down to Sylmar as our renewables. But that's a renewable source of energy. But we still have all this carbon fueled power plants in addition to the nuke plants. And I agree with you on manufacturing the energy crisis, but that's nothing new to California since Ray Davis and Enron.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the race down there because Rocky Chavez, since Issa dropped out, is the main Republican opponent, and he, like you, is military. So I read an article which said that you and he would be leading in the polls, and you would probably be a sure thing to win if we didn't have these two other establishment Democrats in the race, Mike Levin and Sarah Jacobs. And I want to talk about how I think the party, all the different organizations related to the party, some of your mainstream NGOs that endorse, and even the mainstream corporate media. I mean, I was disgusted to read this column in the San Diego, the San Diego Union Tribune, which is a Tribune paper about to merge with Sinclair Media, which they call Trump TV. And I don't know this guy, Michael Smallins. It's clearly a column, so he's an opinion writer. And the whole title of this article is Why Applegate is a Problem for Democrats in the Race for Congress. And literally 50% of the article is talking about these ridiculous charges of you stalking, harassing, and threatening your ex-wife, which she has, disputed twice now. And then at the end, and then it talks about Levin and makes him like a environmental attorney. Like, that's a good thing. You're going to tell us what he represents in a second. But in the end, they say the last 3 paragraphs, literally the last 3 paragraphs says, but Applegate brings other positive things to the table. He gained national attention for knocking off Issa and has residual good name identification, and his career in the military and down the line liberal positions on almost all issues, putting him in sync with Democratic Party progressives. I mean, I just could not believe this article when I read it. So your thoughts?
Well, if he would have said I'm a problem for the Democratic Party because I point out the fact that the Democratic Party stopped talking to working families, he would have been right, because that's what I've been talking about. And you can't just show up. Let me give you an example. All of the opponents came into the race without platforms, and they slowly evolved their platforms. But they were for the ACA. We need to fix the ACA first. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying for the past 3 years, that is a failed plan. It was a Heritage Foundation plan, didn't work in Massachusetts. And Obama was wrong to just reinstate health insurance companies for their administrative costs and their own profits that would only make a system less efficient. Now they've suddenly, during about the middle of the last 18 months, all of the other Democratic candidates have started talking about, I'm for single payer and I'll back, Senator Sanders, Medicare for all. But if you look at their most recent, mailers that they're now putting out, which I refer to as political pornography that everybody just pitches, they're again saying we need to fix the ACA first. And none of them have yet to really come out with a stated position on a vote for the use of military force. And that's why I get back to the veterans are deploying at such a rate. There is a ready-made constituency that wants somebody to talk to them, and nobody else does. They understand the benefits of a single-payer healthcare system because that's what TRICARE is. That's what military hospitals are. And they've improved substantially since 1974 when I started. So this is a test tube district to run on issues. Throw away all the labels.
Yeah, but here's the thing. The Democratic Party must have a death wish because they refuse to do this. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has said And I didn't tell you this when we talked earlier, but I organized a protest last summer. There was a national DNC, local CDP summer resistance tour. And they were at USC, and we wanted to get in there and talk to them about single payer health care. And we had to actually protest and disrupt that meeting in order to have that conversation. The thing that they handed out with their new platform didn't have anything related to health care. And Nancy Pelosi, when asked if the Democrats were going to run on single payer in 2018, she said, no, I don't think the country is there yet, even though the vast majority of Americans, including Republicans, want to see Medicare for all. The reason they don't want to do this, and this is why I would hope that you would eventually leave the Democratic Party, is that the Democratic Party does not want to antagonize their corporate donors because it's still all about the money for them. And they are making the same mistake in 2018 that they made in 2016, which is running against Trump, not Trump, as opposed to running on this positive platform that you're talking about. So I want to know how you can get around the noise. Is Mike Levin an environmental attorney? It sounds like he's out there, working for Greenpeace or environmental, Earth Justice or something like that. What kind of environmental attorney is he?
He's only signed 3 pleadings in his life that I've been able to find, and they were all representing homeowners. He was representing countrywide against homeowners who had lost their homes and who were suing for wrongful foreclosure, which is a difficult suit as a plaintiff attorney to bring. But that's the only thing he's ever done as far as an attorney. The only thing that he's ever done with any of the carbon bridge fuel corporations that he's worked with since approximately 2009, 2010 has been as the government affairs VP or the government affairs officer. And that's code for he was hiring lobbyists.
Lobbyists, yeah.
And the specific bridge fuel that they were always interested in was gas, whether or not it was fracked gas or whether or not it was gas that bled off of an oil field that they could oxidize in theory, which has never been commercially feasible up to this time. And so he's never, and now when he started, he said he was an environmental attorney. And he was actually catching a lot of negative reviews. He was rated as unacceptable by either five to seven San Diego clubs, including the San Diego Democratic Club for the Environment, because he's a fracking natural gas lobbyist. That's
yes.
What he's done. And he likes to say, well, I ran the Orange County Democratic Party. He ran it for 8 months, and it was a midterm. No real successes in Orange County because it was still heavily and deeply red. And he can't bring up any electeds that will say anything good about him.
Will he have environmental attorney on the ballot? Is that what's going to show?
No, he's changed his pitch. Now he's a clean energy advocate.
Oh my God.
But he was working for Fuel Cell up until I think the end of 2017. And Fuel Cell has been a big advocate of clean coal. They go to trade meetings all over the country preaching clean coal.
Now, let's talk about the Democratic Party. Now, the CDP did not make an endorsement because you have to get something like 60% of the delegates there. And they have these pre-endorsement conferences that happen before the state meeting that I went to. What happened with the clubs? What happened at the pre-endorsement conferences? And what happened at the state meeting down in San Diego relative to your race?
Well, the clubs are part of the process to get the region pre-endorsement prior to the convention. And nobody got even close to the 60% necessary at the pre-endorsement meeting with the region, which is essentially a state senate district with some overlap. So then we moved to the convention at the end of January, and it was never close that anybody was going to get the endorsement, and that was really the main play for the corporate establishment Democrats, because if they got that, that would have freed up a lot of money from the state party. That did not happen, and ever since then, we're left with NGO endorsements, which are always sort of a crapshoot, because a lot of the larger NGOs have become big corporate entities unto themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to question that the Sierra Club endorsing someone who has never really worked with renewable energy. He's always been a bridge fuel lobbyist.
Right. Well, the Sierra Club, the NRDC, the League of Conservation Voters, they're all these big green groups that, you know, they actually have a lot of people on their boards who have oil interests. It's surprising, but true. You told me that even though Levin didn't get the endorsement, they're still doing a lot of things behind the scenes, shenanigans. My viewers love to talk about Democratic Party shenanigans. Can you talk about some of the things they're doing behind the scenes?
There have been people in the Levin camp, Park Skelton for one, because I have a document with Park Skelton's metadata on it.
Let's identify him as a consultant, a mainstream Democratic consultant. Very
mainstream Democratic consultant. And there's been not quite a whisper campaign calling me a wife beater. And that there was never anything close to that. My former wife and mother of my children has always strongly supported me in statements, both in 2016, and she did one in January 2018, stating that she's always supported me, will vote for me, and any allegations against me that there was physical violence is absurd, because it wasn't. It was in the context of a heated divorce over visitation and custody. We were past that a long time ago. And I've been telling people I'm a strong backer of the Me Too movement, and the first tenet thereof is to believe the woman. Well, believe the mother of my children and my former wife, because she's not voting for anybody else other than her ex-husband, me.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you that I've been told that Judy Chu, as well as Tony Cardenas, have actually called me a wife beater, which, given the most recent developments in the case of Tony, is, I mean, you know what? There's a little bit of karma being reapplied on that patch of road, and I haven't got any idea the validity or potentiality of any of the allegations against Congressman Cardenas, but I'll tell him right now, if you're watching this, stop lying about me, because there might be consequences when you're lying about a 4-decade trial attorney who's never represented corporations and always worked on the basis of I eat what I kill, contingency fee attorney.
Let's talk about your other opponent, Sarah Jacobs, who's the granddaughter of Irwin Jacobs, who is the founder of Qualcomm, who started out with $1 million of her own money in the race. She's a millennial. She's got the pink pussy hat crowd, as I call it, the Women's March people, Emily's List probably NARAL, I'm not sure, Planned Parenthood. Let's talk about her. Not very qualified, right?
Well, look, this is the way I approach this. You know, I'll give, I'm not going down a rabbit hole here on me, so just bear with me, Lauren. The only reason that Cosmo asked to talk to me on an interview was because of Sarah Jacobs. And quite frankly, I find that she probably has a very bright future. The author of and Cosmo was really talking to me because they were doing a piece on Sarah. And I said, look, she is a very well-educated, very likable young woman who's very capable. And then the author said, well, it must be frustrating that somebody so young is causing such disruption to your second run for the 49th. And I said, well, I disagree with both of the metrics. One is I love 20-year-olds, young men and women in the Army and the Marine Corps. I've trusted them with my life. So age has nothing to do with it. Experience and street savvy are something that you can acquire earlier. And I'm sure that Sarah's going to acquire that because she, as by her own admission, she recognizes that she's had a lot of opportunity in her life. And I think that she, up to this point, she's used her entitlement to work for good causes. But if she, and this is pointed out by another piece that was run in the UT, ironically, that did note that if Sarah would win a seat in Congress, and she served out her full term, that would be the longest job that she ever held up to this point in her life. And I think that you just have to spend a little bit more time to get the experience, savvy, and inside appreciation to go to Congress.
Right. And I agree. And I agree.
And I don't necessarily fault her for being a self-funder, although I think most people are going to say you shouldn't be able to buy a seat in Congress, no matter what your wealth. I think that you need to have a contact with the constituents. So it's a little bit frustrating that I actually have two multimillionaires who like to get into a little bit of a context every now and then as to who's worth more. And then Mike Levin, whose claim that his claim to fame is he's raised so much money, but Park Skelton has spent most of it for Mike, and he just doesn't have that much money now that he didn't get the party endorsement back in January. So it's going to be very interesting because every poll that's been run up to this point has me as leading, whether or not it was Darrell, whether or not it was the other Republican, and certainly among all the Democrats. So I'm anxious for the primary to get here, and we've only got 26 more days.
So who has endorsed you? Let's talk about the organizations, the labor groups. There are revolution chapters. Is there a DSA chapter down there, Democratic Socialists of America? Who do you have backing you?
I've got the LA Orange County Building Trades. That's 125,000 members. It's the largest building trades in the United States. And by the way, as I like to point out, I sat down with him. I was very blunt about which infrastructure programs I would approve of. And one of the big ones, both for the laborers, is, hey, we really want to build the toll road that goes through South Orange County. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't support that. First of all, there's already been a stipulated court settlement that it's not going through the state beach. And toll roads are not the answer for tomorrow's infrastructure. We need to build mass transit. Yeah. And mass transit is also our only way of getting to affordable housing. And so I got that endorsement, I'm quite proud to say, by being honest with labor.
Good.
And telling them, look, I'm not going to tell you that you can build every infrastructure program.
Yeah, because they support fracking and they support every pipeline to transport oil and gas. And yeah, the building trades have been some of the least environmental groups out there.
But there's plenty for organized labor and building trades to do that is going to be beneficial to the environment. And what I like to talk about is, but you have to have politicians that are going to push forward those infrastructure programs.
Right.
Look, growing up in a blue collar family, they're going to go and work on the jobs that are underway. And when it's a question of keeping food on the table and keeping a roof over their heads, I can't expect people that are barely getting by or just aren't that well-to-do to always pay for the environmental programs. But it's up to politicians and leaders to recognize what has true value, what's going to have long-term costs in terms of the environment. But getting back to endorsements, so yeah. I've got LAOC Building Trades. I have National Nurses United and the CNA, California Nursing Association, and that's because of the fight for SB 562 and my position on single-payer health care. And I talk to them all the time about biotech being the only one searching for cures. And if I had a bumper sticker that I would really speak to my heart, it's Big Farm doesn't believe in cures.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems with Big Farm. I have all the locals for Orange County, LA, and I have DFA.
Good.
And gosh,
what about Our Revolution, Bernie Sanders' successor?
I have. Okay, this is a little bit of a sore point for me. All right, because I have the San Diego chapters of Our Revolution, the Orange County chapters of Our Revolution, and they have been, whipping for me for 18 months. And Our Revolution National announced last week they're not going to make an endorsement until after the primary.
I'm very disappointed to hear that about Our Revolution, because I saw Nina Turner last week, and I was pitching her to try to get them to endorse Tim Canova, because Tim Canova went independent, and Our Revolution says they're not tied to any particular party, and we know he's progressive. And she said to me what they say to everyone when asked is that it depends on their local chapters. If their local chapters endorse a candidate, they have to be the one to lobby the national. So hearing this about not endorsing until after the primary, that's a new one for me, and I think that's BS. Tara Samples, right, is Nina Turner's best friend, and she was Dennis Kucinich's running mate. Bernie wouldn't even endorse Dennis Kucinich. His son did, but Bernie didn't. So unfortunately, I think some of these groups, we can't idolize individuals, we can't idolize groups, because they have to, play with the Democratic Party, which is one of the reasons I left the party, and one of the reasons I hope you will leave the party at some point. But I know you're running as a Democrat now, and I think you are the most progressive Democrat. So that segues nicely into, how can people help you? How can people get involved in your campaign? I'm putting your website up on the screen right now.
That's it. And that's where you're going to get our platform. That's where you're going to get an ability to volunteer. And by the way, volunteering, we need callers coast to coast. We've got a cloud-based auto dialing system that is really impressive. So you don't have to live in a district. You don't have to live in California. And I think it's important to get people just to hear your name. Now, I've been at this now for 3 years. And the fact of the matter is, I appreciate that you're not going to be able to get the top 3 issues in your campaign to enough people. And particularly if you just say, well, I got to knock on every door and I got to hand them a card and I got to talk to it. It's important. And I think people fail to appreciate, hey, as long as they know the name, as long as they know where they're running, and they say, hey, that's me. I live between San Juan Capistrano and La Jolla along the beach, and I'm going to be looking for a particular name, because I remember the first time I was voting, it was from a governor. It was 1972. Yes. I had just turned 18, and I was savvy enough that I said, this is not going to work. There's no way this guy's going to win. He should, but I got, of all people, Nixon. In the first election I'm in. But after I got past that, I didn't know anything about the people that were on the ballot. I wasn't even familiar with their names. Now, I was 18. I was no different than any other 18-year-old. But that's why it's important just to get out your name, just to give them some small indication about what your experience level is. And that's why I usually lead with, hey, he's an Iraq vet who thinks war is a racket, and he's a Marine colonel. He should know, and we need your vote. And that's one of the most important things that our nation is facing, which is the longest chicken shit war in our history.
Yes.
And that's enough. That doesn't talk about my top 3 priorities with health care, preschool through 16, which I've come to evolve and say, no, it's got to be a government private effort to educate people all the way through their lives. Otherwise, you aren't going to be able to participate in tomorrow's economy. And
yeah,
of course,
you were even talking to me earlier about AI and robotization and automation. So you're even talking about beyond college. You're talking about retraining workers. Yeah.
Retraining. Which, by the way, I want to throw in just my 2 cents on the TPP and where I stood the last time around. I said, I can tell you that the dispute resolution portion of that alone made me say, no, I'd never vote for that. I'd never accept that. I think that for any lawyer to say, yeah, this is a good trade deal, it would have been legal malpractice.
Yeah.
And the big failure of most trade agreements is the workers who are left behind are forgotten, brushed aside. And that's really created the income disparity that's the worst since the Gilded Age.
Exactly.
Because workers just are tossed away.
Right. We will end the show, and I will have you back another time because I really enjoyed talking with you. I enjoyed
it too.
So I'll have you back on, and I wish you great luck. I'm going to let you go right now so that I can pitch my next show. But thank you very much for being on The Robust Opposition, Doug.
Thank you, Lauren. You have a good evening.
You too. So until you next see me, please share this show and keep fighting.